If you're a teacher who is constantly feeling negative about teaching and constantly frustrated by all of the many aspects of teaching, you probably have part of you that wants to quit, and maybe it's a large part, but part of you still loves to teach. You probably find yourself complaining about the students, their parents, your admin, your school, your district, your state, just all these different aspects of teaching that you are constantly feeling negative about. However, somehow you in general still love teaching and it brings you joy. If only you could wave a magic wand and fix all the things that ail the education system. But guess what? You can't. So in this video, I'm going to discuss what could possibly be making you feel this way, plus what you can actually do about it. And these are things that you can actually have control of. Now, first of all, the one thing that you can control is putting your finger on the like and subscribe button so that you don't miss any future videos about how to make teaching kind of less crappy. Okay, but really, let's start off by talking about your ego. Now, when people hear about the ego, they think about egotistical, about being self-centered or being selfish or being conceited. But the ego is actually something that we all have, and it's there to help us navigate through life and protect us. It's a part of us that helps us make decisions, form opinions, and sort of develop this sense of self. But the ego can also be our biggest enemy. It can lead us to make poor decisions or form really harmful beliefs and lead us to feeling insecure. And this can actually really show up in our classrooms in terms of how confident we are in front of the students and with our peers. Our ego can really get in the way of us being the leader that our students need us to be day in and day out. It affects how we present ourselves to our students and how our students respond to us. As I mentioned in my last video, there's definitely a cause and effect relationship between how we show up for our students and how they respond to that and how they behave in our classrooms. So really getting an idea of our ego and wrapping our brains around it is super important. So our ego plays a huge role in our fight or flight response. When we feel threatened, we're either going to fight or we're going to run. And this is really important if we're, being attacked by a bear in the woods or something like that. However, in today's world, unlike our ancestors, we're not threatened by things like that on a daily basis. Instead, our ego kicks in when we feel threatened in social situations, maybe some relationship conflicts, and definitely at work. In addition to fight or flight, there's also freeze. So our ego can cause us to just shut down and not act when we're faced with some kind of stressful situation. Our mind and body feel paralyzed and stuck. And this is a form of protection for us, but it can cause us to not take action or to actually try to solve a problem. So these definitely show up on a daily basis with the stressful situations that we face at school. So a 12-year-old may talk back to you or say something disrespectful to you. And this could cause you to feel defensive or anger and respond in that way. Or if an administrator or a colleague give you some not so nice feedback, you might retreat into your shell and just completely avoid the issue at all. And in either situation, it can also cause us to just avoid thinking about it by retreating to things like going and shopping or drinking or eating or something like that. So as you can see, our ego and our fight, flight, or freeze response can have a huge effect on how we show up and how we respond to the everyday things in teaching. Now, let's talk about triggers and how this also affects our teaching. So when a situation triggers a negative memory or emotion from the past, our body responds to it before our brain can even register what is going on. This can trigger our fight, flight, or freeze response. And so we act instinctively and subconsciously and maybe in a way that isn't really appropriate for the situation. So this can show up as us yelling at a student or going into our shell if multiple students are misbehaving, or maybe resorting to something like just scrolling endlessly on social media or something to just numb our feelings because we don't know any other way to cope with that trigger. I've actually seen this with some teachers where so many students are misbehaving and they're just sitting at their desks staring at their screen. I once walked into a classroom like that where a teacher was sitting at her desk just looking numb, and there were students actually standing on the desks being disruptive. And it was obvious that she had just shut down because she had lost control of the situation, and it just triggered her freeze response. And the worst part is that we can inadvertently perpetuate these triggers. So a student misbehaves, our ego kicks in our fight, flight, or freeze response. The student reacts in an undesirable way, and then we go back into that kind of response again. And it's just this vicious cycle, and it's something that we can actually avoid. Plus, this can happen in multiple situations in one day, in your classroom, in the staff lounge, at recess, in the principal's office, at parent-teacher conferences. It becomes really overwhelming, and we get to question whether or not we're cut out to be a teacher, and if this profession was really meant for us. The reason why this topic is so important is because as teachers, we can learn to be resilient and push through when we feel triggered throughout the day. Many of us love teaching, but these microaggressions and these triggers that happen, it can really take a toll on us mentally and even physically. And unless you've done the work in terms of addressing your triggers, you may not be aware that so many things are actually triggering you, and you may be wondering why teaching is kind of driving you insane. So the first step in conquering your triggers is to actually address the trigger. And this can actually be really hard and painful because it causes you to look into your past, especially at things that are painful or that you've probably hidden away and didn't really want to think about. You want to identify things that may have a lasting effect on you today. For example, one of my triggers is feeling isolated and feeling rejected. So as a kid, I was often left out of groups. Kids didn't necessarily want to hang out with me, but I would still tag along with whatever group was nearby so that I wouldn't feel alone. I was never anyone's favorite person or anyone's best friend, their go-to person who they always wanted to talk to or hang out with. And this was when I was growing up. It changed later on as an adult, but I still remember those feelings of being rejected and left out. So this showed up in my teaching by me wanting to be liked by my students, me wanting to be that cool teacher, that funny teacher, the teacher that kids want to go and visit during their lunch, because it felt good. I finally felt accepted by someone, even if they were 12-year-olds, it still felt good. It also affected my relationships with my colleagues because I didn't really have a lot of friends in the beginning in terms of teacher friends. So then, of course, I felt rejected despite the fact that I wasn't putting myself out there to meet them or hang out with them. And so it took a while for me to create those connections. If I had made those connections sooner, I could have gotten help a lot sooner too, and maybe not been so frustrated in the beginning of teaching. Another trigger that I have is having really high expectations of myself. And this came from my parents, and I love them because they made so many sacrifices for me to be who I am and to get where I am today. But they had some unreasonably high expectations of me. This caused me to be a perfectionist and to have a lot of anxiety around things like doing things perfectly or getting perfect grades or being top of my class, which I never was, and that really weighed on my self-esteem. I was also afraid to do anything outside of my comfort zone out of fear of failure. So this definitely showed up in my teaching in that I had unrealistic expectations of my own students. I would get frustrated when they wouldn't complete an assignment or do their best on an assignment, or if they wouldn't bring their materials, if they showed up late, if they misbehaved. I was just pretty disappointed in them in the beginning for just not trying to be the perfect student. I remember getting mad at students who were okay with a C. In my mind, it was like, why are you only okay with a C? Everyone should try to get an A. But then I realized there are more important things than grades. You know, things like family, church, hobbies, sports, their self-esteem and mental health, even things like basic needs like food and water. Some of my students were living in foster homes, had parents using them as pawns in divorce proceedings. Sometimes they only ate when they were at school because there wasn't any food at home, and I was getting on their case about grades. So those are just a couple of the triggers that I have. But coming to terms with your own triggers and how they show up in your teaching, in your classroom, is really going to be the first step in terms of starting to like teaching a little more when you're super frustrated. So the second step is to envision how you want to be. What kind of teacher do you want to be? How do you want to interact with your students, ideally, in a perfect world? Even when they're misbehaving, What would it look like in terms of how you would react? How would you interact with other adults in your school or even your friends and family? How would you do it differently if you could? Since you've probably just been reacting up to this point, you actually have to plan how you want to react and will react in the future. It took a combination of therapy, journaling, and meditation to get a handle on my triggers and plan out how I wanted to react when I was with my students and other people in my life. They affect me far less now than they did even a decade ago, and my students and my teaching are better for it. Another tip is to recognize how it feels in your body when you're reacting, and then have a plan for how you're going to address it. Now practice that. Practice exactly what you're going to say or do. Maybe have a mantra or a saying. Maybe take 5 deep breaths or slowly count down from 10. Something that you can actually remember to do when your body feels triggered. Because these memories actually aren't just in our brain. Our body remembers negative emotions and trauma as well. So knowing this will help you in the moment before you just react and pop off. It would also be helpful for you to plan what you would say to disruptive students or in certain situations. Practice saying those things out loud and pretend that you're saying it to the student. That way, when it does inevitably happen in the beginning, you would have rehearsed it and you'll be calm and collected, and you're going to be the teacher that you've envisioned yourself to be. And finally, just keep trying to do better one day at a time. It's taken years to be less reactive in the classroom, and I still slip. Last year, I had a group of 8th graders that drove me up the wall. And in the beginning, for the first couple of months, I was kind of reactive because I wasn't used to being confronted with those types of behaviors. But I remembered all the things that I had practiced before that I sort of forgotten about in terms of being less reactive. And I brought it all in. And then I remembered all the things that I do to be less reactive to my students when they're triggering me. And it made it so that I could develop a better relationship with them. And that in turn made it so that they acted up less in my class. While I was practically pulling my hair out in the beginning and frustrated and borderline yelling at them in just a short amount of time, they were actually some students that I really look forward to seeing every day. And I'm still one of those teachers that still loves to teach. I'm happily a teacher. I have no intention of quitting. And if you're a teacher who would like to get to that point where you like going to school, you're excited to see your students, even the ones who are kind of like knuckleheads, then addressing your triggers, it's going to go so far in terms of not only teaching, but also your personal relationships. Now, if you're a teacher who still struggles to see how your demeanor affects your classroom management, be sure to click on this video next so that you can get all the tips and tricks on how to conquer that.